AP Lang teachers, Beth Hall from Coach Hall Writes here. In today's video, I want to share with you some of the projects I've been having my students do this year to help them prepare for their AP Lang argument essays. The activities that I'm going to be telling you about today are ones that I've been doing throughout this school year. However, if you're watching the video at the time I upload this in March of 2024, you might be able to choose one or two of these activities before the exam, or you might want to save these activities for next school year. I'm going to link a doc that has an explanation of each of these projects in the description box below. So please make sure you look for that. And also I'll include a link to my teacher email list. I promise I won't flood your inbox, but my email list is a great way for me to share tips, tricks, and other resources with fellow AP Lang teachers. So if you're interested, please make sure you sign up for that as well. So here is a quick teacher tip that I apply to many of my larger assignments in my class. And that is I try to add in a grammar component. For our state test, my students take the ACT. And so I go over the different types of advanced punctuation like colons, dashes, semicolons. And while it's important for me that they understand how to identify whether the punctuation is used correctly in a multiple choice situation, I also want them to apply this understanding to their writing. So I typically require that they include advanced punctuation in their responses. I also sometimes include an advanced vocab requirement. And as part of the assignment requirements, I have my students highlight these. So in my class, typically grammar is yellow and vocab is green. It makes it easier for me to double check this as I'm grading. And if students have to highlight the grammar or the vocab, it reminds them to include it as well. I found that the more I require my students to do this, it not only enhances their writing skills, but it also helps with that ACT prep as well. The first activity I want to tell you about is Convince the Class. This one was one of my students' favorites this year. Basically, what they did was they selected a topic, they conducted research, and then they crafted a proposal. So essentially, they were trying to convince the class of whatever their position was. This year, we had a range of topics, everything from schools should have a 4-day week to orcas should not be held in captivity. One of the things that I like about this is that it involves student choice. So my students were really excited about the topics that they got to choose. I gave them a list of some pre-approved topics, and then I also let them suggest topics of their own. This was an excellent idea because they had some wonderful topics that they were passionate about that I had not previously considered. I had my students create a multimedia presentation and they had to pitch their idea to the class. This also helped reinforce our understanding of the rhetorical situation because they knew that their classmates were their target audience. And so tying this back to AP Lang, this activity helps students create a line of reasoning. I also had them think of possible objections to their argument, and they had to refute those objections in their presentation as well. And one of the things that I liked about that component was that some students anticipated the objections and refuted them quite early in their presentation, depending on their topic, whereas others saved it for the end because it was more convincing that way. Another one that my students liked was Teach the Teacher. So this was kind of similar to Convince the Class, except this time the class was not the audience, I was. So basically they had to select a topic that they were interested in. They conducted research and they wrote source summaries. You could also have them do research notes. Keep in mind that you can adapt these instructions for your students' needs. So if you look in the description box for that doc, please know that you're able to adjust the assignments to what your students need and what's appropriate for your school. After conducting their research, my students had to write an essay in which they tried to either inform or persuade me about their topic. One of my classes was so into this that they actually made me a grading playlist, meaning that they took a poll of all the topics in the class and they decided which order I should grade them in for maximum comedic effect. And given the range of topics they had, it was really interesting for them to put an order together. Now, this was not a requirement. This was something that they thought would be funny and they took upon themselves, but it was really interesting because normally I just grade things in alphabetical order by last name on Google Classroom, but this time I had a pre-selected list that my students put together, and it actually did make the grading process more interesting. And of course, when they were trying to figure out the funniest order for me to grade things in, they tried to go from one extreme to another when it came to topics. My students did make the case last month, and admittedly, I wasn't sure how they were going to respond to this, but I posted it to their Google Classroom a day before I intended to talk about it. I just kind of put it there, and they came into class that day wanting to know if they could do this particular case or that case, or they wanted to add cases to the list. So I would say they were pretty hyped about it, especially because I hadn't even officially assigned it yet. So basically with Make the Case, they have to pick a case. It can be a Supreme Court case. My students in APUSH or AP Gov were able to use their textbook and their notes if they chose this option. I also allowed them to choose a famous court case or a cold case. Now, with the cold case, you need to be careful with your school's rules about that kind of thing. But I have a lot of students who are self-proclaimed crime junkies, and they loved this idea. So students conduct research and they provide research notes with citations. I've been using these projects as an opportunity to remind my students of how to do MLA citations. That also kind of ties into synthesis as well. So for this one, I had my students write a detailed summary of the case. I believe I required a 2-paragraph summary for this, and then a 3rd paragraph in which they analyzed the impact or significance of the case, basically trying to get them to think of the broader context, kind of like that so what moment that you might see in commentary or in a conclusion of an essay. Now, I'm not sure if any of my students will get to use the information that they researched for this in their Q3 essay on the AP Lang exam, but the reason why I like these projects is because it gives students tools in their toolbox, if you will. One of the biggest struggles that students have told me about over the years is that they're not confident in their evidence. They're not sure what to write about. So my goal with these projects is to give students something to write about, to help them be experts on a few different topics. And I really like the student choice element because I feel like that increases their buy-in. In case anyone's curious, before I explain the next one, I guess I should explain how long I give my students to do this. And basically what has worked well for me has been to assign it at the very beginning of the month, and then it's due at the end of the month. That's easier for them. It's also easier for me. That being said, we're working on time management because when I designed these projects, I intended for students to work on them a little bit each week, either in class or out of class. But as fellow teachers, I'm sure you can understand that sometimes what we intend with the time management doesn't always happen. So please pick a time frame that is appropriate for your students. This month, we're doing famous figures. So I had my students select a famous person. It could be someone who is living or someone who is deceased. And I had them conduct research. If you have the opportunity to, I would encourage you to have your media specialist help with this. I put together a list of different figures that I wanted my students to possibly consider. And she not only pulled books of those people, but she also had some other books that she recommended. And basically, we did kind of like a book tasting type thing in the library to kick off this project. She had the books laid out and students got to look at them and sample them because I wanted them to actually read a book about their famous figure. Now, you don't have to require a book, but that might be something that you consider, especially if you feel like your students aren't reading longer texts. This can be a great way to incorporate a level of independent reading. I also wanted my students to have different types of sources, so I suggested podcasts and articles as well. The idea behind this is that students will take notes as they research, and again, they'll practice citations. I had my students write a developed paragraph using their famous person as evidence for a provided Q3 prompt. So basically what I did is I chose 3 prompts from past exams that I felt were pretty versatile, and my students got to look at those prompts and then figure out which one their person would be good evidence for. I know a lot of teachers try to incorporate current events, so here is my version of it. For in the news, have students select 3 to 5 events that are in the news and write a detailed summary about the event. Personally, I'm okay with students using news from TikTok and other forms of social media. I like to meet my students where they are, and those are the platforms that they tend to be on. That being said, I also give them other resources that I encourage them to check out. So there's All Sides, there's procon.org, there's The Donut, CNN in 10. There's probably others that I have forgotten to list here as well, but you can tweak the assignment instructions for whatever fits your students. But the idea behind this particular one wasn't just that I wanted students to write about current events, but I also wanted students to realize that they are exposed to different news, maybe different stories in pop culture that they might be able to use for a Q3. So I want to kind of take the news that they get for fun as they're scrolling through social media and try to get them to think about it in an academic way. So with this one, for the summary, I have them not only summarize the event, and I tell them to make sure that they're summarizing it as if the person reading it doesn't know about the event. That way, they're appropriately detailed. I also have them think about the broader implications of the event. So why does this matter? What do we learn from this event? Why is this event or incident important to the general public? Now, I saved independent reading for last, mostly because this one was probably my students' least favorite, mostly because it was probably the most time consuming, but I do think it was valuable. First, they selected a nonfiction text. Now, I provided a list for them of what we had available in my classroom library and also the school library. So as students read, they identify vocab words that they're unfamiliar with. I had my students write the word, the part of speech, the definition, and a sentence of their own because I wanted them to practice using the word correctly. I also had students select a short passage, 1 to 2 pages usually. Usually 1 page worked better, but there were a couple cases where students wanted a longer selection of text. And I had them write a rhetorical analysis paragraph about a choice that the author makes in order to achieve their purpose, convey their message, or develop their argument. So even though these assignments tend to be helpful for Q3, there are times when I try to incorporate Q2 skills as well. For part 3 of this assignment, I had them create their own argument prompt. So I told them they could either use a quote from the text or they could look up a quote that was thematically linked. And I had them write a thesis and body paragraph that used the book as evidence, and it had to be in response to the prompt that they created. Now, I will say I did this in the first semester, and that might have been too early. They still did very well with it, but I did have to help students construct their Q3 prompts because they weren't as familiar with the wording. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think next year I'm going to save this for the second semester. I think I did it just a tad too early this year. And I think that might have also contributed to why my students like this one the least. They really loved convince the class, teach the teacher, and make the case. So one thing to consider is just the order of these as well. You could also scale back on the assignment, but I do think it's important to note that I did give them a month to do this. If you're looking for an activity to give students right before the exam, check out the description box for my Q3 database. That's something that I've given my students the last several years before the exam, and I'm going to do it this year as well. I'm going to have them take their knowledge from these projects and use it for their Q3 database. But even if you haven't done these projects, you can still have your students do that Q3 database. There aren't many ways for students to cram for the AP Lang exam, but this activity has helped my students feel more comfortable with Q3. So again, I'll leave the links for that in the description box below. And until next time, happy teaching.